I never expected to see him again, especially like this. On a cold, rainy evening in Rochester, New York, I spotted a frail man shivering on a park bench. The man who once left me, who broke our family decades ago, now looked helpless and broken. My heart raced as I approached him. Should I turn away and walk into the warmth of my car, or face the truth that could change everything I thought I knew about life, love, and forgiveness? My name is Linda Thornton. I'm 64, a widow living in Rochester, New York, and I work part-time as a museum assistant. After decades of hardship and heartache following my divorce from David, I had finally created a quiet, peaceful life for myself. The mornings were calm. I would wake up to the sunlight spilling across my kitchen counter, the aroma of brewed coffee filling the room, and the distant sounds of traffic mixing with the occasional chirping of birds. I had learned to find comfort in small routines, cataloging exhibits, helping visitors, and occasionally attending small social events organized by the museum. My children, Rachel and Ethan, were independent adults who had their own lives, and while I sometimes missed their constant presence, I had learned to embrace the quiet as a space where I could reflect, heal, and simply exist without constant worry. Life had been harsh, but I had found a way to navigate its turbulence with dignity, and I believed that I had finally found a sense of equilibrium that David's betrayal had long ago threatened to destroy. Even though I had created this calm, part of me always remained alert, cautious of sudden shocks that life sometimes delivers without warning. Memories of the past lingered quietly at the edge of my mind, the nights when David argued endlessly over trivial matters, the silent dinners, where we sat like strangers the day he left me for another woman, and the years of empty apologies and unfinished conversations that never healed the void in my heart. I had learned to live with those memories, not as a burden, but as a reminder of my resilience. I often reflected on how far I had come, how I managed to rebuild not just my home, but also my sense of self-worth, my inner strength, and my independence. And yet, even in this peace, I knew that life had a way of throwing unexpected challenges in our path, moments that test whether our strength and compassion are truly unshakable. I never imagined that one such test would come in the form of someone I once knew intimately, someone who had left scars that took decades to fade. I have 2 children, my daughter, Rachel, 33, who lives in Boston and works as a software developer, and my son, Ethan, 35, who lives nearby in Rochester but often remains distant, caught up in his own career and personal life. Their absence in my daily life had been a quiet ache, a subtle reminder of the family I had once envisioned. Rachel would occasionally call, her voice cheerful yet rushed, always in a hurry to return to her busy life in the city, while Ethan's visits were infrequent, brief, and sometimes awkward. Despite the physical distance and emotional gaps, I loved them fiercely. Their achievements, their independence, and their choices in life were sources of pride, yet also a gentle reminder that time and circumstances had shifted us into separate worlds. I often found myself longing for simple evenings together, sharing stories over dinner, laughing at old memories, or just sitting in silence, comfortable in each other's presence. Growing up, both Rachel and Ethan had been my constants, my anchors during the storm of my separation from David. I had spent sleepless nights worrying about their emotional well-being when their father left, guiding them through moments of confusion, anger, and hurt. Watching them become strong, independent adults was both gratifying and bittersweet. Gratifying because they had grown into remarkable people despite everything. Bittersweet because I realized that the closeness we once had could never be fully restored. I had tried to fill the quiet of my home with routines, hobbies, and volunteer work. But there were moments when the silence felt heavier, the house echoing with memories of laughter and chaos that once filled it. Yet, despite these subtle pangs of loneliness, I had learned to embrace my solitude and the independence it offered. I knew that life is unpredictable, that joy and sorrow often coexist, and that sometimes the lessons of resilience come not from victories, but from enduring the quiet, unseen battles that shape us into who we are. One icy evening, as I walked home from the museum after a long day, I took my usual shortcut through the small park near my neighborhood. The wind was biting and the clouds hung low, casting the streets in a pale gray light. It was then that I saw a man slumped on a bench, wrapped in a threadbare coat, his hands shaking as he tried to shield himself from the cold. At first, I assumed he was homeless, another face in the quiet despair of the city streets. But then he lifted his head, and my heart stopped. The face staring back at me was unmistakable. It was David, my ex-husband. The man who had left me, who had shattered our family and my sense of security, now looked frail, helpless, and utterly broken. His eyes, once confident and sharp, were dull with exhaustion and shame, and his lips trembled as if he could barely summon the words to speak. The sight of him there, so vulnerable and exposed, sent a flood of memories crashing back. The arguments, the broken promises, the nights of loneliness, and the betrayal that had changed the course of my life. For a moment, I simply stood there, unable to move, unable to decide whether to turn away and preserve the fragile peace I had built, or to approach him and confront the past that still lingered like a shadow over my life. The park was quiet, save for the distant hum of traffic and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind, creating an eerie, almost cinematic backdrop for this unexpected reunion. My heart raced, and a mixture of anger, pity, and curiosity churned within me. How had he ended up here on this cold bench, looking like a ghost of the man he once was? The thought of walking away felt instinctive, safe, protective of the life I had painstakingly rebuilt. Yet something deeper, an unexplainable pull of empathy, whispered to me that I could not simply leave him there. This encounter was more than coincidence. It was a moment that demanded courage, compassion, and perhaps a reckoning that neither of us had anticipated. For a long minute, I just watched him. His coat was thin, his hair unkempt, and the dirt on his face suggested he had been living on the streets for some time. Memories of our life together, the house we shared, the vacations, the long nights of laughter and arguments, all collided with this stark image of a man who had once been proud, confident, and seemingly untouchable. I almost turned away. I thought of the safety of my home, of my warm kitchen, and the quiet evening waiting for me. I thought of my children, Rachel and Ethan, and the distance they maintained, and the fear that opening the door to David again could shatter the delicate balance I had achieved. And yet, even as I turned to leave, I felt a twinge of something unexpected, a pull, almost magnetic, that reminded me of the humanity hidden beneath every failure, beneath every mistake. The man sitting there was not just the one who had hurt me. He was a human being, vulnerable and in need. I drew in a deep breath, feeling the cold air sting my lungs, and slowly stepped forward. Each step seemed heavy, weighted with the memories of the past, the anger, and the hurt. Yet, with each movement, I also felt a strange sense of resolve, a recognition that life often presents opportunities to act not out of obligation, but out of compassion, courage, and understanding. As I approached him, his head lifted slightly, and our eyes met. There was a flicker of recognition, and then something more. Shame, guilt, and fear all wrapped into one. In that frozen moment, the world seemed to pause around us, the city noise fading, leaving only the quiet, tense connection between two people whose past was complicated by love, loss, and betrayal. David's eyes, once so familiar, now held a mixture of desperation and regret. He whispered, barely audible over the wind, "Linda, please don't walk past me. I have no one." His voice cracked, trembling as if the words themselves were a confession of all the wrongs he had committed. Something in me softened, despite decades of pain. I realized that here was a man who had lost everything, stripped bare of pride and pretense, facing the raw consequences of choices that had once seemed inconsequential to him. For a moment, I simply soared, my own emotions a turbulent mix of anger, sorrow, empathy, and cautious curiosity. The memories of heartbreak and betrayal were still there, gnawing quietly at the edges of my mind. But beneath it all, a deeper instinct whispered that this encounter was about more than old grievances. It was about humanity, accountability, and perhaps an unexpected chance at reconciliation. I finally stepped closer, the crunch of gravel under my boots echoing in the quiet park. He flinched slightly, as though afraid I might scold or reject him outright. But instead, I simply sat down on the bench beside him, careful to maintain a respectful distance, and said softly, "David, tell me everything. I need to know what happened." The words were gentle, yet firm, a bridge between the past and the uncertain present. And as he began to speak, describing the events that had led him here, I felt a strange mixture of sadness and resolve. The understanding that life had brought us together once more, not for vengeance, but for truth, closure, and perhaps forgiveness. I led David to a small diner a few blocks away, its neon lights flickering softly against the wet pavement, casting a warm glow that contrasted sharply with the cold gray night. The smell of sizzling bacon and brewing coffee filled the air, bringing back memories of simpler times. And for a moment, I allowed myself to feel a sense of calm in the midst of this emotional storm. We slid into a booth near the corner, the vinyl seats cold and cracked from years of use. I ordered him a hot meal, eggs, toast, and coffee, and watched as he picked at the food hesitantly, his hands trembling slightly. His eyes darted around, uneasy, almost as if he were afraid of being judged by strangers. And yet there was a vulnerability that reminded me that beneath all the arrogance and cruelty of the past, there remained a human being in need of care. As we ate, I finally asked, "David, what happened to you? How did it come to this?" He swallowed hard, paused, and then began recounting the events that had led him here. His second marriage had been a catastrophe. The woman he had chosen over our family had manipulated him financially, drained their joint savings, and ultimately abandoned him when illness struck. He had lost his house, his possessions, and the fragile sense of stability he once enjoyed. The story came out in broken sentences, halting pauses, and sighs, each word heavy with shame and regret. Listening to him, I felt a tightening in my chest. Part of me still wanted to turn away, to leave him to the consequences of his choices. And yet another part of me, the part that had grown and matured through decades of hardship, felt compelled to hear him out, to understand the journey that had brought this man, who had caused me so much pain, to such a pitiful state. I could see the pain etched into his face, the hollowness behind his eyes, and I realized that life had dealt him harsh lessons, and perhaps there was no one left to help him understand them except me. The diner was nearly empty, save for a few late-night patrons and the low hum of the coffee machine, and it created a strange intimacy that made it easier to focus solely on the words he was speaking, on the remorse that poured from him in quiet, fragile bursts. As I listened, I felt a subtle shift within me. The anger and bitterness that had lingered for decades softened slightly, replaced by a cautious empathy. Even as I struggled with the memories of betrayal, I could not deny the humanity in front of me, the brokenness that demanded acknowledgement and, perhaps, a measure of compassion. David's confession was painfully detailed. He explained how his new partner had slowly isolated him from friends and colleagues, convincing him that he owed her everything, and how she had taken advantage of his trust, leaving him destitute. The words spilled out, each sentence carrying the weight of humiliation and loss. He spoke of nights sleeping in shelters, the relentless cold seeping through thin blankets, and the constant fear of being ignored or assaulted on the streets. His voice trembled as he recounted the moments when he wished he had reached out for help, but had been too proud, too ashamed to ask anyone for assistance. The more he spoke, the more I felt a strange blend of sorrow and incredulity. It was almost surreal. The man who had once commanded rooms, who had exuded confidence and control, now reduced to whispers of regret and trembling hands. As he spoke, I noticed small details. The calluses on his hands from labor he had never intended to do, the deep lines in his face from countless nights of worry, and the haunted look in his eyes that spoke of loneliness far more profound than material loss. I realized that his suffering had stripped away every trace of arrogance and pretense, leaving only the raw, vulnerable human beneath. For the first time in years, I saw the man who had made mistakes, who had caused pain, and yet who was capable of remorse and reflection. It was a difficult mix of emotions. I still remembered the betrayal, the anger, the nights of tears. Yet I also felt a budding compassion that was impossible to ignore. The diner around us faded into the background as I listened, feeling both the pull of empathy and the tension of decades of unresolved emotion. By the time he finished his story, I was exhausted, emotionally spent, yet there was a strange sense of clarity. I understood that the past could not be undone, that the pain he caused could not be erased, and yet here was an opportunity to decide how to respond. Would I let anger dictate my actions, or would I choose a path that reflected the growth and strength I had cultivated over decades? The answer was uncertain, but the first step, listening, acknowledging, and witnessing his truth, had been taken. He looked up at me, tears glistening in his eyes, and whispered, "I treated you so terribly, Linda. I deserved every bit of this, but I never wanted to hurt Rachel or Ethan." The weight of those words was almost unbearable. I could feel decades of pain pressing against my chest, yet beneath the hurt there was a subtle current of understanding. The man who had abandoned me was no longer the same person. He was fragile, vulnerable, and painfully aware of the consequences of his actions. I remembered the countless nights spent alone, the endless worry about my children, and the silent anger that had simmered beneath my calm exterior. And yet, sitting across from him in this quiet diner, I realized that human suffering is rarely simple or absolute. People make mistakes, choices have repercussions, and sometimes life teaches lessons in the harshest ways possible. His eyes pleaded silently for some acknowledgement, some gesture that said, "I see you, and I recognize what I've lost." I did not immediately forgive him. That was not possible. Not yet. But I allowed myself to feel compassion, to recognize that he had reached a point of reckoning few people ever encounter. In a strange way, this moment felt almost sacred. Two people bound by a shared past, confronting truths that had long been buried under years of separation, anger, and resentment. The diner's low hum, the occasional clink of dishes, and the distant sound of traffic created a cocoon in which time seemed to pause. For the first time, I felt that the story was no longer solely about betrayal, but about human frailty, accountability, and the possibility of healing, however tentative or fragile it might be. By the time the meal ended, I had made a silent decision. I would help him in whatever way I could, not because he deserved it, but because I had learned over decades that compassion is a gift we give ourselves as much as others. This choice would not erase the past, but it would allow me to reclaim my power, to act from a place of empathy and strength rather than resentment. Bringing David home temporarily was a decision fraught with tension. The familiar streets of my neighborhood, the warm lights of my home, and the quiet comfort of my kitchen now felt layered with anticipation and unease. Ethan's reaction was immediate and intense. He crossed his arms, his face a mix of disbelief and anger. "Mom, after everything he did, why are you helping him?" I could feel the tension radiating from him, the same mixture of protectiveness and unresolved resentment I had often encountered when discussing the past. I understood his perspective. The anger was justified. Yet, I also knew that holding on to anger indefinitely serves only to perpetuate suffering. I replied calmly, "Because compassion is never wasted, Ethan, even when someone doesn't deserve it." My words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Ethan did not respond immediately, but I could see a flicker of uncertainty cross his face. The recognition that while our emotions are valid, sometimes the path of humanity requires difficult, unexpected choices. David, seated quietly in the corner, seemed almost overwhelmed by the warmth of a home he had long abandoned. His eyes scanned the familiar surroundings, lingering on photos of our children, on the furniture that had once been shared, and on the small personal touches that make a house feel like a home. For a man who had lived in isolation and despair, the contrast was striking, almost painfully so. The evening unfolded slowly, punctuated by awkward silences, careful conversations, and moments of tentative understanding. I could see that both my children and David were processing their emotions, each in their own way. The tension was palpable, yet beneath it lay the potential for growth, for acknowledgement of past mistakes, and for the first steps toward reconciliation. I felt exhausted, emotionally drained, yet also a sense of clarity. Sometimes, helping someone is less about absolving them and more about reclaiming one's own humanity. Over the following days, David began contributing in small ways around the house. He repaired the leaky faucet in the kitchen, painted the porch railing, and helped clean the garage. Each task was performed with quiet diligence, small gestures that reflected a sincerity I had not seen in decades. Watching him work, I noticed the subtle changes in his demeanor, less defensive, more thoughtful, and increasingly aware of the consequences of his past actions. The house, once quiet and still, now carried a sense of tentative collaboration, an unspoken acknowledgement that both past and present were intertwined in ways that demanded patience, empathy, and careful attention. Evenings were spent in quiet reflection. David would sometimes sit by the window, staring out at the dimly lit streets, and I would catch glimpses of the man who had once been confident, now humbled by circumstance. Conversations were cautious, deliberate. We spoke of practical matters, shared small anecdotes. and occasionally touched on the past, always mindful of the delicate balance between acknowledgement and recrimination. The process was slow, often awkward, yet undeniably meaningful. It became clear that rebuilding trust, even in small ways, requires time, consistency, and a willingness to witness both vulnerability and remorse without judgment. Through these interactions, I began to see that the man before me was not seeking absolution, but an opportunity to regain a measure of dignity. And while forgiveness would not come overnight and full trust might never be restored, I realized that this period of coexistence, however brief or tentative, allowed for the possibility of closure, understanding, and perhaps a gentle form of redemption. Each repaired fixture, each quiet conversation, and each gesture of cooperation was a small testament to the transformative power of accountability and human compassion. As the days passed, the tension in the house slowly began to ease, though it never fully disappeared. Ethan remained skeptical, occasionally questioning my decisions and David's intentions. "Mom, are you sure this is safe? Can we trust him?" he asked one evening as we sat in the living room, the soft hum of the heater filling the background. His concern was genuine. After all, he had grown up witnessing the turbulence of our family life and the betrayal that had followed. I understood his wariness, but also knew that avoiding confrontation, avoiding humanity in favor of caution, was not the answer. "Ethan, trust is built slowly, and compassion is not a weakness. We're offering him a chance to rebuild, not erase the past," I replied. My voice carried a quiet firmness, a confidence born of years of reflection and personal growth. David, meanwhile, remained quietly attentive to his surroundings. He did not speak unless spoken to, and even then, his words were measured, thoughtful, and tinged with the weight of humility. There were moments when he would glance at photographs of our children, a faraway look in his eyes, perhaps imagining a different path, perhaps mourning the choices that had led him here. Witnessing this, I felt an odd mixture of sorrow and relief. The man who had once caused so much pain was no longer a figure of dominance or cruelty, but a human being grappling with the consequences of his actions. The house became a space of subtle tension, yes, but also quiet growth. An arena where forgiveness, patience, and human dignity could coexist alongside skepticism and emotional scars. I often found myself reflecting on the lessons of this period, watching David engage in small acts of responsibility, seeing him rebuild basic skills and routines, and observing his humility made me recognize the profound capacity for change within human beings. Life is rarely linear. Mistakes, failures, and betrayals leave their marks. But even in the darkest moments, there exists the potential for self-awareness, transformation, and cautious reconciliation. As Ethan observed these changes, I could sense his internal struggle gradually softening. Though trust would take time to rebuild, the simple acknowledgement of effort, consistency, and accountability was laying the groundwork for a fragile, yet important, form of connection. David's gestures of responsibility became more intentional over time. He repaired the leaky faucet in the kitchen, painted the porch, and reorganized the garage. Tasks that may have seemed mundane, but carried profound symbolic weight. Each repair, each act of service, was a silent testament to his willingness to contribute, to atone, and to rebuild a life that no longer relied on deception or selfishness. The shift was subtle, almost imperceptible, but undeniable. He was no longer the man defined by arrogance, abandonment, or entitlement. He was a human being committed to small but meaningful actions. Evenings were spent differently now. Instead of the silent distance that had characterized the first days of his return, there were tentative conversations about the weather, local news, and occasional stories from his time on the streets. There were no excuses, no deflections, only honest recollections and cautious engagement. Watching him navigate these interactions with humility and care gave me a quiet satisfaction. It became clear that accountability is not demonstrated in grand gestures or dramatic confessions, but in the small, consistent efforts that reveal sincerity over time. I also noticed subtle emotional shifts in Ethan and Rachel as they visited. Ethan, initially guarded, began observing these changes, acknowledging that while the past could not be erased, the present offered an opportunity to witness growth, resilience, and genuine remorse. Rachel, though still emotionally cautious, softened in moments of genuine interaction, seeing the complexity of human experiences that cannot be reduced to right or wrong. These moments highlighted an essential truth. Healing, trust, and forgiveness are processes, often messy, gradual, and requiring patience, empathy, and courage from all involved. One evening, David handed me a handwritten letter. His handwriting was shaky, uneven, and slightly faded, but the words it contained carried immense weight. He apologized for every betrayal, every harsh word, every moment of neglect and selfishness. The letter was not dramatic or theatrical. It was simple, sincere, and painfully honest. As I read, tears blurred my vision. I thought of all the years I had spent alone, the nights I had cried silently, and the quiet resilience it had taken to rebuild my life. And yet, reading his words, I realized that this gesture was not about erasing the past, but about acknowledging it, taking responsibility, and demonstrating a desire to change. The act of writing and sharing the letter created a pivotal shift in the household. It was a tangible expression of remorse and accountability, a bridge between past mistakes and the possibility of cautious trust. I felt a mixture of sorrow, empathy, and a subtle sense of closure. The man who had hurt me, the one who had abandoned his family, was no longer seeking to defend his actions or justify his choices. He was simply admitting his failures and showing a willingness to engage with their consequences. It was a profoundly human moment, one that underscored the complex interplay between guilt, growth, and redemption. The major action I took was to enroll David in a community rehabilitation program designed to help individuals regain independence, stability, and dignity. This decision was not easy. It required balancing compassion with caution, offering support without fostering dependency, and ensuring that my children understood the boundaries and rationale behind this choice. The program provided structure, social support, and practical assistance, helping David to develop sustainable routines and re-enter society in a meaningful way. Over the weeks, I watched him attend sessions, engage with counselors, and gradually regain confidence in his own abilities. The transformation was slow, but noticeable. He became more self-reliant, more reflective, and increasingly aware of the consequences of his past actions. He began setting small goals, completing them, and sharing his progress with me. The experience highlighted a vital life lesson. Helping someone does not mean excusing their past mistakes, but providing them the opportunity to confront, learn, and rebuild. Compassion, coupled with accountability, can create pathways to redemption that anger, resentment, or avoidance cannot achieve. By the time weeks turned into months, the household had changed. The tension softened, replaced by cautious understanding. Ethan and Rachel, seeing David's consistent effort, began to engage with him more openly, though with the awareness that full trust could not be rushed. David had become more grounded, responsible, and reflective, no longer defined by arrogance or deceit. And I, Linda, found a profound sense of peace in witnessing human resilience, in seeing the consequences of choices, the power of accountability, and the potential for growth, even after betrayal. Moral life. Lesson. Life sometimes brings back those who hurt us, not to reopen wounds, but to show us how much stronger, wiser, and compassionate we've become. Forgiveness does not mean forgetting, but it allows us to reclaim our humanity, move forward, and embrace the lessons life offers. The past cannot be changed, but the present can be shaped with courage, empathy, and conscious choice.